Selected Short Stories, The White Line, by John Ferguson. Before McNabb had sat down in his chair at the dinner table in the Magnificent, he heard a woman's voice speaking to him. "So we meet again, Mr. McNabb." Mrs. Westmacott looked up at him with a smile on her clever face. She was an acquaintance he had made on the journey from Washington. McNabb expressed his pleasure. "You're lucky," she said. "So I see," he answered with a bow. "It's not because they placed you next to me. You didn't think I meant that." McNabb looked around as he picked up his spoon. "Well, it's the luckiest thing I can see at the moment, quite enough to content me." He added, "Why, man, they have given you a front seat for the comedy, and you don't know it. What a waste! There are people on board who would give $1,000 in cash to change places with you." "I wouldn't accept," said McNabb, "unless you changed also." "Ah, and in the train you denied that you were Irish." McNabb did not utter a word. He only gave a smile that might have meant anything. People at the tables were a little unusually quiet. But that was quite common on the first night at sea. Later, when they got to know each other, there would be plenty of talk and laughter. The sight that met his eyes was gay enough with the women's coloured frocks and their many jewels. "Do you never ask questions, Mr. McNabb?" As he turned to her, Mrs. Westmacott was clearly very eager to give him the information that his look around had failed to discover. He laughed to himself at the idea that he was not a curious person. His head still ached with investigations, which had kept his mind busy for weeks. "I was looking for the comedy you spoke of," he said. Mrs. Westmacott turned to him, some fish at the end of her fork. "And found it?" He shook his head. "To the right opposite, the rather youthful girl in black. Between the two young men," said Mrs. Westmacott. "You must recognize her." "I'm not an expert in American beauty," he added. "Still, I should think so indeed. Her picture is in every paper. That's Sally Silver." "Really, Sally Silver? Where have I heard that name before?" Mrs. Westmacott laughed. "How wonderful you are! Oh, how I wish she could hear you!" "My mind can be very slow," McNabb said. "At times I haven't seen things under my very nose you would never believe. Tell me about her." "She's Henry Silver's only child, and you won't say you haven't heard of him. She's just 20 and the biggest catch that ever came out of Chicago, but no man's caught her yet." McNabb was regarding the girl with interest. He had wondered already why her presence there had drawn all eyes in her direction. Without doubt, the girl was pretty, but hardly beautiful. Her face had not enough composure for real beauty. The eager search for new pleasures was to be seen on her face. He felt a little sorry for her. "The other women would like to be in her place," said Mrs. Westmacott. "Her diamonds alone make the women hate her." "She's wearing none." "No. The little cat knows very well that all women on board are wanting to see the famous Bernese necklace her father has just brought for her. That's why she has left it in her cabin." "And they hate her still more for that?" "Naturally." McNabb resumed his dinner. "The men don't seem to miss the diamonds," he said. "No. She has a fine neck, and her shoulders are brave." McNabb again looked over at the two men and the girl. With both elbows resting on the table and with her chin on her hands, she was listening to the young man on her right, while the young man on her left, who had seen nothing but her shoulder all through the meal, sat sadly. "The two favourites in the race," Mrs. Westmacott explained. "No much doubt which is doing best." Mrs. Westmacott looked at him in great surprise. "You men," she said. "You think because at the moment she's only given attention to Jefferson Mellish, she has quite finished with Hilary Hardin." "Well, by the look on his face, young Hilary Hardin seems to think the same." "Probably he does, being a man, but any woman could tell him it might not be the case. She knows that most people have been betting on Hardin." Knapp was surprised. "What?" he cried. "You don't mean to say that people are betting on it? I don't think that fitting and proper." "You don't? Of course it's quite decent, you English, who flog horses to make them run races for you to bet on. You call this not fitting and proper? Why, Sally Silver is proud to know America is betting on this, and both men must know it. As for Hilary's chances, I'm not sorry my money is on him." "You have a bet on this?" "I have. I have the chance of winning what will pay for my 6 months' trip to Europe twice over. You are surprised? You think I should have backed Mellish? Who is good-looking and rich, while Harbin is almost poor, and still has a stiff leg he got in the war?" She took McNab by the arm and spoke into his ear. "That stiff leg is no handicap in a woman's eyes. You put something on him too, no? Well, you'll see. In 2 days there won't be a person on board who hasn't made a bet on it." And Mrs. Westmacott was right. McNab wondered at it. They were all like children, he thought. There was nothing to show, so far as he could see, that Miss Silver must necessarily choose either of the young men, or at least choose one of them before they reached port. It was just a chance. One night in the smoking room, he pointed out how foolish the thing was, and half a dozen voices immediately offered to bet him on that very chance. McNab went away in astonishment. They could not really know, of course. Life on board a liner was so quick that minutes were as hours on land, and hours as days. So many things happened quickly, things that would hardly happen at all, to the same people anyway on land. That must be why they were all so certain that something would happen in the matter of Sally Silver. Now, McNab was an eager student of human nature. His work brought him into touch with the darker side, but his connection with New Scotland Yard had not made him a narrow specialist. He remained interested in human beings, in all the different types and kinds, which fact was probably the reason for his great success at his work. Therefore McNab turned an eye on Miss Silver, on her two favourites, and on the betting over their chances with all the interest that he generally gave to the study of human nature. The men, he found, all betted on Mellish, who seemed to know the fact. He had a way of smiling that the woman did not like, but the men backed him, while the woman, without exception, backed Harbin. For 3 long days the good-looking, well-dressed Mellish received all Miss Silver's smiles, while young Harbin, with his stiff leg, made his way along the deck to his lonely chair, followed by the sympathetic looks of the ladies. Then on the 4th day a change came. It came just at the moment when Mellish's success seemed complete, when the men, quite sure that their bets were safe, had stopped laughing among themselves, and the woman almost began to doubt. That is to say, just when interest was dying down, Miss Sally Silver decided to change things. Very early on the 4th morning, one of Mellish's backers, coming on deck, found her and Harbin, their deck chairs side by side, holding each other's hands. The news went round very quickly. At breakfast, the men exchanged ideas with each other. By lunchtime, they were whispering together about it in corners, and all through the long afternoon there was a silence in the ship that reminded McNab of a Sunday afternoon he once had to pass in Tunbridge Wells. For all that afternoon Miss Silver and young Harbin sat together, and Mellish walked round the deck alone. To the men who carefully watched the pair on deck, their afternoon seemed to have no end. What it seemed to Mellish, none but Mellish knew, and he did not tell. At tea, Mrs. Westmacott crossed to the corner in which McNab sat with Captain Bayliss. "Well," she said with a smile. The captain looked angry. "It won't last," he grumbled somewhat sharply. "I hear some of you men are already trying to bet on both sides. No, we never did that." "Our man's not finished yet." She turned to McNab. "Is that your view?" "Well, I don't know. He is of the type that takes what he wants." "It won't last, you'll see," the captain repeated as Mrs. Westmacott returned with the sugar. "That monkey is only showing interest in Harbin to give the woman a bigger drop. She knows that the cats don't love her much." He began to stir his tea irritably. Mrs. Westmacott held out the sugar to him. "An extra piece today?" she suggested sweetly. But after dinner that night the affair took a new turn, one which brought McNab into the business as an official of New Scotland Yard. It was a fine moonlit night, and McNab had gone up the long deck to finish his cigar while taking a little walk. It was still early, but most of the men were down below in the smoking rooms, while the ladies were in the musical saloon. McNab therefore had the deck almost to himself as he walked backwards and forwards, first up one side and then down the other, with a long row of cabins in the centre. So quiet was it that above the noise of the engines, as the boat cut her way across the smooth sea, McNab could hear somebody playing the piano in the distance. But the deck, with its row of wide cabins, was quite empty. He was watching the black smoke from the boat till it grew thinner and the moonlight came through it, when he heard a sharp sound behind it. It was like the opening of a door which has just been painted. His surprise at hearing the sound on the quiet deck held his attention for a moment. Then he resumed his walk without thinking any more about the happening. When he reached the end of the deck, however, he found something that amused him. Miss Sally Silver was sitting there alone. Several times that evening in the course of his walk he had come close enough to see Harvin seated by her side and hear the sound of their voices. Not 10 minutes earlier, Harvin had been there, but now his chair was vacant, and a rug lying on the deck looked as if it had been thrown on one side. The girl, her elbow on the arm of the chair, and her chin on her hand, seemed to be looking sadly at the moonlight on the water. If there had been a quarrel, and everything pointed to it, McNab smiled to think how it would excite the ship from end to end. Who would have dreamed that the affair would end, not with Sally Silver leaving Harvin, but with Harvin leaving Sally Silver? Now McNab was an observer, not a talker, so he simply turned round and continued his walk. Afterwards he remembered quite clearly that he had turned round, that is to say, instead of crossing over the deck and continuing down the other side as he had been doing for the best part of an hour, he for the first time went back the way he had come. He had gone half the length of the deck when he saw a man come out of a cabin a short distance away, close the door quietly, and come quickly towards him. Then the man stopped suddenly, as if at sight of McNab, held back for a moment, and came on again. McNab thought, though the man passed him with his head down, recognized him from his stiff leg as young Harvin. He was probably on his way to the girl again. McNab thought with a smile, noticing that the cabin had the number 13. Looking back, he saw Harvin now in the full moonlight, walking with his stiff leg. McNab, throwing the end of his cigar overboard, took out his watch. It was 30 minutes to 9. His exercise was over, so he went to the lower deck. He had been in the smoking room for nearly an hour, watching a group playing cards for rather high money, when a man entered in such a hurry and with so much noise as to cause nearly everybody to look at him immediately. "Heard the latest?" he asked out of breath. There was so much meaning in his voice that even those who had not looked up at his entrance now looked up from their game. Indeed, everyone present looked up hopefully. Men reading put the books and papers on their knees. Even the man dealing out the cards stopped his arm in mid-air to regard the speaker, for it was plain there was something new in the Silver Mellish Harvin affair, or at least they hoped so. McNab thought he knew what it was, and that he could have told them as much when he entered an hour ago. He was rather amused by this man's seizing at a piece of news which made him seem a man of importance, for the moment. "No!" cried a number of impatient voices, the fellow enjoying the interest he had caused. "Sally Snakeless has gone!" "Gone?" "Stolen from her cabin tonight." "Is that all?" "I'm not the least bit sorry for her." Someone said with a feeling of dislike. Many others agreed. The man continued to deal his cards again, and the old gentleman lifted the books and papers. What else could she expect, making love up there to that fella? This seemed hardly fair to McNab. Had the thing happened when Mellish was the girl's favourite, their opinions would have been expressed otherwise, and Mellish would not have been that fella. "She'll never get it back. The thieves on liners are clever. But on a ship, after all, they can't run away. You'll see. You can be quite certain they had a good place where they could hide it before it was taken. This comes of her choosing cabin 13. I remember once." McNab heard no more. He left the saloon. He wanted to think. Cabin 13, he was quite sure that was the one out of which he had seen Harvin come. Harvin, of course, might have been sent there for some purpose by Miss Silver herself. That was against the idea. It could easily be decided by Miss Silver. The fact that he had stopped on seeing somebody coming towards him and had walked past with his head down, but again Harvin must have known that his stiff leg would give him away if he had nothing to hide. Why had he acted like that? Harvin was no professional thief, of course, for the expert would not have been taken by surprise, and besides, he was like Mellish, an old friend of the Silver family. But why had Harvin been so surprised to see him? It was to this question McNab returned most. Harvin must have known that he had been walking the deck all the time, Then why the surprise? He had stopped a moment at sight of him. Why? Suddenly the detective struck his hands together as the explanation came to him. Of course. "I've been walking round and round the deck houses until I saw the girl in the empty chair," he said to himself, "just like a policeman, but that last time I turned back, and when he came out of the cabin he thought that I'd be on the other side. But what a fool the man was not to put the thing back once he knew he had been observed." McNabb lighted another cigar. Perhaps, he thought, Harbin had no chance to go back. Perhaps, as was quite common, he supposed his stiff leg was less easily noticed than it really was, and believed he had not been recognized. The way he had walked past with his head down suggested he had that belief. The detective in his dark corner grinned to himself. Harbin would probably keep the diamonds. He did not know whom he had passed up there in the moonlight. There was little danger of such an amateur in crime as Harbin becoming afraid and dropping the things overboard. He must need them very badly indeed. Had he come away without sufficient money for the trip? He could not ask Miss Silver for money, and he could tell himself that it was really for her sake, and that in the end she would be happy. Later he would tell her all, perhaps, and she would cry out, "You poor boy, why didn't you ask me for money?" So the young fool would picture the happy ending. McNabb did not wish to force himself on the others indeed. He did not suppose that his help would be required, but knowing his duty in such matters, he went to see Miss Silver. The maid told him that Miss Silver did not wish to see anybody. Well, his knowledge of Harbin's actions would keep till morning. McNabb himself went to his cabin. Next morning he was much later at breakfast than usual. He had slept badly. He had not for some reason been able to forget this case so easily. He had lain awake thinking it out. He had been through all the facts repeatedly, and there were some things that left him in doubt. He was, however, hardly seated before he saw that something new had happened. People stood in little groups with their heads together. They were nodding and whispering. Mrs. Westmacott, seeing him, come across and took a place beside him. "Well," she said, "you've heard what they are saying?" "No, what is it?" "They say the thief is a man with a stiff leg. He was seen coming out of her cabin." McNabb almost jumped out of his chair. "What?" he cried. "What's that you say?" You know what that means. There aren't many men on board with a stiff leg, are there?" "I've only seen one." "Well, that seems to point to him, all right. Do you think he did it?" McNabb was once more able to control himself. He looked hard at her. "I did," he said, "till you told me others are saying he did." "What do you mean by that?" "It sounds strange, but the explanation is simple. I was the only person who saw him come out of her cabin." "And you have not mentioned it to anyone?" "Not unless I have been talking in my sleep. And do you?" she inquired. "No," she replied with a grin. "Moreover, that's one of the things forbidden us at Scotland Yard." Her astonishment was to be seen in her face. "Scotland Yard, are you—" "Not a word. Just tell me who you think did it." "Mellish," she answered quickly. "He's your man." McNabb shook his head. "In a case of crime, the first question to ask is, who benefits?" "Well, he does," Sally was certainly. He put a hand on her arm to stop her. "Yes, but this Vernese Nicholas supplies a sufficient motive to a few hundreds of us, perhaps. Mellish would have one motive, which no one else but Harbin had. That is, Sally Silver herself. But the motive of Sally Silver's diamonds would be equally strong for a far larger number. Still, I feel sure it was Mellish. Something tells me." "Yes, your dislike of him. And if I were to put the case before any of these men, they would, for the same reason, be equally sure it was Harbin." "And you?" she asked. "I think it might be anyone but you. That's why I ask your help." "Me?" she said in surprise. "Women are said to talk." "They do. So do men. Look at them." As he put out his hand for the marmalade, he nodded towards a group of men talking eagerly together. "You mean to take up this case?" "Yes, you see, this thief has brought me into it. He used me. That's what it means. For it was someone who imitated Harbin's stiff leg and stopped at the sight of me. He expects me to say I had seen Harbin coming out of the cabin. He used me. That's what I don't like, you know, if it was Harbin himself." McNabb stopped thoughtfully. "You need my help because the thief knows you know and will be very careful?" Mrs. Westmacott asked. "Especially when he finds I shall say nothing, you see. he continued. "We have not only to find the thief, but to stop him, if he becomes afraid, from dropping the necklace over his side." Mrs. Westmacott sighed. "To think I should find myself trying to save her necklace. I shouldn't dream of doing it if I wasn't sure Hilary Harbin hadn't taken it. You can't be certain that someone else wasn't hiding up there, watching both you and him." "I don't deny it. Anything is possible, and if we can prove that Harbin did not do it, so much the better for your bet. Will you help me?" "What do you wish me to do?" "Very little, and that little easy. I'm not going to report what I saw to Miss Silver or to the captain. I'm not going to ask any questions. I'm going to sit out on the deck entirely lost in a book. All I want you to do is to come and give me news of what happens from hour to hour." "It sounds just a man's idea of a woman's job. But what if nothing happens?" "Then come and tell me." At 11 she came to him with her first report. Harbin had tried to see Miss Silver, but she had refused to talk to him. A notice had been put up asking anyone who had been on the deck between the hours of 8 and 10 to report it to the captain. At 11:30 she reported having seen Miss Silver and Mellish together on the upper deck. At noon she returned with the news that Harbin's cabin was then being searched. There was a crowd outside the door. McNab sent her off to join the crowd, while he sat on, interested in his book. She was back in half an hour. Nothing had been found, of course. She laughed. The amusing thing is that Harbin finds that he himself had been robbed. "Oh, it's nothing of importance, just a leather collar box missing." "Ah," he said with a start. So much meaning was conveyed by the word that she was surprised. "Did Harbin mention it?" "No, the steward who looks after his cabin did." "A leather collar box. It would just hold the necklace, I suppose." McNab lay back again in his chair and shut his eyes, while Mrs. Westmacott waited. She waited a long time, or so it seemed to her. She began to think McNab must have fallen asleep, or so still was he. Then he surprised her again. "What is the color of Harbin's door, red or green?" he asked. "Neither. It's white," she replied, wondering if he was mad. "Good. Do you think you could get me a ball of wool?" "A ball of wool?" she cried. "What for?" "To catch the thief. If any lady friend can supply us with a ball of wool, we have him." "Heaven above us," she said, struck with surprise. "Let me see," he went on. "There is to be some music tonight, isn't there?" She was pleased to see that he was normal once more. "Yes, in the music saloon. There will be some piano music and—" "Well," he interrupted, "we shall be able to do something too, if you can find me that ball of wool." Mrs. Westmacott was very nervous in the music saloon, extremely worried about McNab. Of course, the events of the last 24 hours had had their effect upon everyone, but the soothing effect of classical music is well known, and perhaps that is the reason why practically every passenger in the ship was present. Even Miss Silver came in on Mellish's arm, looking very pale and tired. Mellish, after finding her a seat, left the saloon, returning some time later with something to put round her shoulders. McNab, Mrs. Westmacott saw, was very nervous. He kept looking at his watch. When the interval came, most of the men seemed ready for a drink. She saw Captain Bayliss come up to McNab with an invitation on his face, and she heard the brief no he received. The men began to move towards the door. The captain now rose and tapped the table. "Gentlemen," he said, addressing those who were moving towards the door, "I regret very much that for the moment it will be impossible for anyone to leave this saloon. You know that a valuable necklace, has disappeared from the cabin of one of our lady passengers. A search for it, which I am sure no honest person would mind, is now taking place. There are, unfortunately, black sheep in most ships of—" Mrs. Westmacott saw McNab rise to his feet. "Excuse me," he said in a level voice. "There is no need to keep these gentlemen, nor to go through the luggage. The necklace is in a leather box in Mr. Hilary Harbin's cabin." For a moment there was complete silence, and then Harbin, pushing through the men in his way, came towards the captain with a very white face. "That's a lie," he called out. "I'll make you eat those words. How do you know what is, or what is not, in my cabin? Who are you?" "I'm the person who saw the man with the stiff leg come out of Miss Silver's cabin last night." An hour of astonishment ran round the saloon like a wave, and Mrs. Westmacott, looking at Miss Silver, saw the girl in her chair with both hands covering her face. Mellish, standing beside the captain, was like most eagerly interested in McNab. I was not that man, Harbin cried out, but in such a way as he did not expect them to believe him, and certainly nobody seemed to. Mrs. Westmacott saw Mellish's gold-filled teeth as he smiled, in the silence that followed. One of the ship's officers entered and handed up to the captain the little leather collar box. As he opened the thing and took out the necklace, the man whispered something to him, and it was evident to all from the way in which he stared at McNab, who was still on his feet, that it had been found where McNab had said. "I had no hand in this. I never took it," Harbin cried out again. "I know you didn't," assented McNab. Mellish, who had gone forward to receive the necklace from the captain, turned sharply. "Since you know so much, perhaps you know who did it?" said the captain in a hard tone. "I do," The reply came quietly, to the astonishment of the whole saloon. "You see, at first I did think the thing had been done by this young gentleman, the man who passed me outside cabin 13. I took for Mr. Harbin. But in the morning, when I heard that a man with a stiff leg had been seen coming out of the cabin, I knew it was someone else. I knew it must be someone else because I was alone on that deck and had not spoken to anyone of what I saw. Anyone might have imitated his walk. Later in the day, when I heard of the missing collar box, it was clear that the guilty person, through fear of discovery, or for some other reason, was going to make people believe that Mr. Harbin was the guilty person. That little box which was missing in the morning would be found when a search of all the cabins was made. People would believe that it had been hidden till the earlier search was over. And when it was discovered later in his cabin, with the necklace inside, the matter would seem clear to all." McNab paused while everyone hung on his words. "All that was easy. The real difficulty was in finding the guilty man. It was, of course, useless to watch Mr. Harbin's cabin all day. The real thief would not go in so long as anyone was in sight. Well, the road was left open, and the thief did exactly what I thought he would do about half an hour ago, and nobody saw him to do it." Mrs. Westmacott saw Mellish's face grow brighter on hearing McNab's last remark. "Then you cannot prove who this black sheep is," said the captain. "I suppose we must be content with." McNab held up his hand. "Pardon me, but that is exactly the task I set myself. I have marked the black sheep." "How?" Half a dozen cried out the question, and did not know they had spoken. "The door of Mr. Harbin's cabin is white. With the help of 2 small nails, I placed a piece of wool from one side to the other 5 feet 5 inches high. I put chalk on the wool so that it could not be seen against the door. The 2 broken ends will be found hanging there now, and the man who entered the cabin ought to have a chalk line across the lapels of his coat, exactly 5 feet 5 inches from the floor." Automatically, Mellish had looked down. He saw what all saw, a thin white line across the lapels of his coat. The silence was broken suddenly by a girl's voice. "Hilary! Oh, Hilary! I'm so glad! So glad!" The words in themselves were no promise, but they were said in such a way that every man who heard them realized that he had lost his bet.